And that's going to lead me to the second part of my talk, which is about archaeology as historical ecology, in which I will try to trace ecosystem change on the Northern Islands through 12,000 years, right up to the present restoration era. And as I said before, historical ecology tries to unite paleontological, archaeological, historical, and ecological scientific data into an understanding of how ecosystems have changed through time and how humans have affected them. And establishing baselines from the past of what ecosystems look like turns out to be really important because it's guiding conservation and restoration efforts on the islands and elsewhere by defining conditions that predate this era of European colonization and widespread ecological degradation. We can set baselines about what ecosystems looked like 400 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, and an increasing number of biologists, restoration ecologists, the National Park Service, the Nature Conservancy are understanding and working with archaeologists actively now to cooperate to try to figure out how to take these ancient data, which seemed esoteric to many people 20 or 30 years ago, and use them in a practical sense to restore the ecosystems of the islands and other areas around the world. It's really, really cool. So to start that historical ecology, just remember that the Northern Channel Islands have changed dramatically. Over 20,000 years or less, they've lost 70% of their land mass as Santa Rosa broke apart, and this, in really important ways, shaped the ecology and ecosystems of the islands. I have a few slides here that just document how we do historical ecology. And part of it is, as I said, is paleontology. Here's my wife, Christina Gill, standing next to what's called a caliche root cast on San Miguel Island. This is a tree of late Pleistocene age that the root systems and the base of the trunk have been preserved in calcium carbonate. This one's about that big around, maybe a little smaller, but some of them are that big around. They're Douglas firs. So there were Douglas firs and other coniferous forests that are much more typical of Northern California or Oregon today in the late Pleistocene. And those have largely disappeared from the islands. This is one way we can understand plant system changes through time. Another one is to study pollen remains on the upper right. You can find them in sediments, sometimes lake sediments, ancient soils, and they are very distinctive. As you can see, you can identify a variety of different species of plants and quantify them, show the changes through time. And then a piece of work that my wife Christina is doing is really important. It's using charred plant remains from archaeological sites, right now spanning about 10,000 years on the Northern Channel Islands. And her work is showing that these particular charred remains, these are the corms or underground root storage systems, like bulbs, of something called Bludix, Dichelostemma capitatum. And she's finding them in virtually every site that we excavate on the islands or sample on the islands, spanning 10,000 years. And that is a really interesting story that I'll get into too. Another thing that we can do is just, as I said, by taking a single shell from an eroding soil or eroding sea cliff, send it off to a radiocarbon lab. It now costs $179 per sample, and they'll send you back within a few weeks a date with a plus or minus of about 21 to 25 years. It's extraordinary advances in radiocarbon dating, and we can go to a place like this. This is San Miguel Island. This is Tori Rick and another one of my former students. To give you scale, this is about a 100-foot dune, 120 feet maybe. And you can see soil here, soil there, soil, soil, soil. There's soils down here, soils down there, soils here, soils up there. And they all have shell middens, the debris of island Chumash occupations. And you know, with just a couple $1,000 and a little bit of time, we can reconstruct a sequence here that shows us 7,250 years of Chumash history and also ecosystem history, both the terrestrial ecosystem and the marine. And we've done this in a number of places on San Miguel, Santa Rosa, and now Santa Cruz, and they're allowing us to compile these really deep records and really detailed records of cultural change and ecological change through time. The other thing that this has done, and we published a paper about 10 years ago, is by doing this, you can also measure the buildup of dunes on San Miguel. And that's important because these surges in dune building have important ecological implications. They change the coastline from rocky shore to sandy beach. They change the hydrology of where you can get fresh water. They change the plant communities that live on them. And by charting dune building, it tells us another story about the changes in the geography of the islands through time. So now I take you briefly to the historic period and the historic Chumash. This is on the upper left, an old map of historic Chumash villages along the mainland, in the interior, on the Channel Islands. This is about AD 1760, estimates of population sizes just before Spanish contact. You can see there are about 20 historic villages known, maybe 22, 24 on the northern islands. And some of them are relatively large, with up to 250 individuals. There are larger, purportedly, villages around the Goleta Slough, Santa Barbara, mouth of the Ventura River. So it appears that populations were even higher along the mainland, but we're actually not sure about that. That's something we're taking another look at. My main point here is that this is a large Chumash village from the historic period. These are giant house pits. You stand in the bottom of them, and the rim is up like this. And they are composed entirely of shellfish and animal bones and charcoal and burned rock and artifacts left behind by Chumash people for millennia. In this case, I think this site is up to 6 or 7 meters deep. What's that, 20 feet, 25 feet? These contain literally millions and millions and millions of shellfish and fish bones and marine mammal bones and bird bones that can help us reconstruct really detailed records of not only the Chumash lifeways and economy, but of the ecosystems that they were living in and harvesting from. And the Chumash, as you know, had a very diverse and sophisticated maritime technology, intensive regional trade with other islanders on the mainland, and it was based on a monetary economy using shell beads that were produced almost exclusively on the northern Channel Islands. So we have these very long records. We can start at 12,000 years to historic Chumash times. But in order to compile complete sequences and connect the ecological studies of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and today with the historical data on fisheries, with the archaeological data, we had a problem on the Channel Islands. That problem was that the Chumash were removed by the Spanish fathers in the 1820s. And we had a gap of about 100 years where we didn't know anything, basically, about what the ecosystem looked like. There simply were no data. At least we didn't think there were any data, until we started thinking about some things that we'd largely been ignoring for years. One of them was these. There are scores of these on the Channel Islands. They are Chinese abalone processing sites. After the extermination of sea otters on the islands and the removal of the Chumash, the black abalone populations in the intertidal zone were released from predation and just went crazy. Abalones piled on top of one another. Chinese came over mostly to work in the gold fields. They have abalones in China, but they've been overfished. And some of them came to the coast and saw these incredible fisheries, and they started systematically harvesting an intertidal industry of black abalone processing, drying, and then shipping to San Francisco and Chinese communities in the West, and also all the way to China. And we kind of knew about these sites, but we just weren't very interested in them until we started thinking about historical ecology, because these date between 1850 and about 1900, right in that gap that we wanted to fill. So one of my students, Todd Brage, who has a book actually just about to come out on the Chinese abalone processing industry and its archaeology on the Channel Islands, started working on these and filling in one of the gaps. The other way that was kind of unique that we helped fill that gap was a bald eagle nest on San Miguel Island. And many of you probably know the story about the collapse of the island fox populations being preyed upon by golden eagles after the piglets had been removed from Santa Cruz Island. The golden eagles started preying on foxes and nearly drove them to extinction. One of the reasons they did that is because there were no longer any bald eagles on the islands. They had been eradicated by the 1940s and 50s by ranchers and ultimately by DDT. And that allowed the golden eagles to come out because bald eagles will normally keep golden eagles out of their range. So this cascading series of ecological changes that started with the local extinction of bald eagles almost led to the destruction of the island fox. Well, the Park Service and the Nature Conservancy and other agencies, once they'd figured out this story, wanted to reintroduce bald eagles to the islands. But before they did that, they wanted to make sure, if possible, that bald eagles wouldn't eat foxes as well, because they didn't know for sure. They knew they'd coexisted for a long time, but they wanted to make, let's cross all our T's and dot all our I's. They sent Paul Collins, biologist at Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, Don Morris, retired archaeologist with Channel Islands National Park, and myself to western San Miguel Island about 15 years ago to excavate this amazing eagle nest. And there are photos of eagles nesting on this in 1937. I'll show you one a little bit later. We excavated this pile of sticks like an archaeological site, sifting all the remains and the soil around it, and we recovered 10,000 pieces of animal bone and animal shells. And we analyzed all 10,000 of those, and only 3 or 4 of them were island fox, and those bones were from really, really old individuals that it looked like may have died and then been scavenged, because bald eagles are heavy scavengers as well. So basically the idea was, yes, it's safe to bring the bald eagles out. They won't kill the foxes. But in the process, those 10,000 bones and marine shells told us a tremendous amount about bird and shellfish and fish populations on San Miguel between 1850 and 1950. It was a cool project. It ended up having some really interesting practical implications. Okay, so now quickly through my historical ecology reconstruction of ecosystems through time. Back to Daisy Cave. There's a 10,000 year sequence there of both paleontological and archaeological of Chumash harvesting. Around the corner is a site called Cave of the Chimneys, and that site was occupied multiple times over the last 8,500 years ago. And when Daisy Cave was abandoned, people seem to have moved into Cave of the Chimneys. So we did small test pits in each of these, collected very large samples of animal and plant remains from both sites, and then compared them. And together we have almost 10,000 years of more or less continuous occupation at one spot on San Miguel Island. Incredible preservation and an incredible record that's just almost unparalleled on the islands or the west coast of North America. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of evidence for fishing in kelp forests, and it appears to be very stable over time. We analyzed 50,000 fish bones, and they're more or less the same species all the way through. By using those records and some from nearby sites, we can at least show some general trends in ancient Chumash harvesting and economy. And this is just a simple graph that plots the meat yield of shellfish, fish, and sea mammals, probably seals and sea lions, sea otters, through time. 10,000 years ago to 7,500 in 2,500 year increments to the present. And you can see here, early on, shellfish are making up 85% of the protein or the meat that we can measure, and it declines through time. By this time, there's still lots and lots of shellfish, but they're getting smaller, as I'll show you. The other thing is that fish are going up astronomically. And there's a total reversal. Even though there's still lots of shellfish remains being taken out of the local marine system, there are a lot more fish. And so fish end up dominating the diet, and marine mammals sort of gradually grow through time, the same general increase. So these are adaptive adjustments, shifts probably to changing environments, changing technologies, and also changing population levels and changing impacts to local ecosystems. Here's one of those. I mentioned that shellfish tend to get smaller through time, and we've shown this for California mussels, owl limpets, and black turban snails, but it's maybe most dramatic in the red abalone populations. There's something we call the red abalone midden phenomenon, where there are very large and very dense middens that are mostly red abalone, and the red abalones are always huge. The heyday of that is around 3,500 to 8,000 years ago, and you can see that it's not a perfect picture. This is a statistical average, but overall we have very large abalones here at 7,500 years, still big here, some sites with smaller ones, but there's a general trend, and look at the last 3,500 years. They're down here, they're less than half the size they are up in here. And we think this is because of human predation, the effects of human predation. The other thing that was really interesting when we plotted this out and we started talking to biologists, those same kelp forest biologists that I met in 2000, 2001 in Santa Barbara, and I showed them a picture of this. This is a San Nicolas Island red abalone midden, and it's about 5,500 years old, I think. And there are hundreds, maybe thousands of red abalones, and you know, that's probably a black abalone. But look how big these are. These things are like dinner plates. And I was just breezily blowing through my overview of Channel Islands cultural ecology like I am today. And I went right by this. I said, this is a red abalone midden. They usually date between 7,500 and 3,500 years ago. And I went on to the next slide, and the kelp forest biologists were like, stop, stop, go back, what's that? And I said, that's a red abalone midden. And they literally couldn't believe it. And the insight that they provided that no archaeologist had ever realized, because we're not ecologists, was that they said, and it's backed up by modern fisheries data and ecological monitoring wherever sea otters are expanding into new areas where there are red abalones, they said it was not possible for this kind of shell midden with these kind of red abalones to exist if sea otters were abundant or even present in the local ecosystem. And I said, but wait, we know they were present. We find sea otter bones all the time. But they said that that's fine, but they must have been depleted. They must have been reduced or hunted out of certain areas. And it made me think a lot about 8,000 years ago when these first show up. And in fact, we have one of these now at 12,000 years ago associated with all those little barbed points. Something had happened as early as 8,000 or even 12,000 years ago where the local Chumash people or their ancestors were probably hunting sea otters and depleting them down to a point where the red abalone populations were exploding. And it actually makes a lot of sense because sea otter fur is the most luxuriant fur in the world. And you live on a cold, windy, foggy island, and you can imagine that every single Chumash person would probably want to have a sea otter robe, sea otter blanket, sea otter cape, something like that. But as populations of humans grew, there maybe weren't enough sea otters, and they depleted them, never wiped them out, but depleted them. And then because they were active foragers with traditional ecological knowledge of the intertidal zone, they couldn't help but have understood that the red abalone populations and black abalone populations exploded. And it makes me think that it'd be hard to prove, but that the Chumash after that point may in fact have depleted otters, not just for furs, but to keep the productivity of the intertidal zone high, an active kind of management to enhance the productivity of the local environment. Well, that raised another interesting question, and it was related to the island foxes. And when we started this work on historical ecology, it was widely believed that the island foxes had been there since the Pleistocene. on the Northern Channel Islands. There were museum specimens that were supposedly found in Pleistocene sediments. The biologists then believed that humans transported those natural foxes, island foxes, to the Southern Channel Islands about 5,000 years ago. Well, we got interested in this issue and decided to radiocarbon date all those fossil fox bones. And what we found was a surprise. None of them were Pleistocene in age. The oldest one was 6,500 years old. We've now dated 20 or 30 additional fox bones from archaeological sites. None of them are older than 7,000 years. And this now makes us believe that actually the Chumash brought the island fox to the Northern Channel Islands. It was not a Pleistocene endemic animal at all. A really interesting idea. It remains somewhat controversial, but I think the evidence is growing rapidly and strongly towards a human introduction of the fox to the islands. What's really intriguing to me is that if they brought them about 7,000 years ago, as it seems, it's just about the time when the otters appear to have been depleted. And so maybe they brought them out as pets, but maybe they also brought them out as fur bearers because they needed another source of nice warm blankets, pelts, capes, etc. So then that leads us to another question. What about the island skunk? How did it get there? Skunks aren't good swimmers. There are not any Pleistocene bones that we know of. We have not dated any of the skunk bones yet, although I'll bet we'll get to that in the next few years. But I suspect that the Chumash probably brought skunks to the islands as well. And that raises a really interesting question about what kind of boat ride was that? That could have been a really interesting boat ride, a long trip. Well, so part of what I'm showing you is some impact of Native Americans on shell fisheries. We can see it also in some fisheries, we think, measurable changes in fish bone size through time. But there are really very few or no extinctions. The island mammoths, the pygmy mammoths, went extinct about 13,000 years ago, about the same time that humans got there, but there's never been a kill site of an island mammoth, either Columbian mammoth or the pygmy mammoth. We may find one at some point, but we know at that same time the islands were shrinking rapidly, their habitat was shrinking, and they appear to have been eating conifers in part, and those were disappearing about 13,000 years ago too. So I suspect the island mammoth was going down. And if humans did contribute to their extinction, it was probably no more than a coup de grace, and we can't even prove that. There is one extinction that we can prove, and with Terry Jones at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and a group of other archaeologists, myself included, we published a paper a few years ago about Chendites lawi, this plump little flightless duck that used to have ground breeding and nesting colonies, large ones on San Miguel Island, that have been dated to 14,000 years ago. They're not there anymore. They are extinct all along the California coast. They have been found in numerous archaeological sites, including that burned specimen from 11,750 years ago on Santa Rosa Island. They went extinct about 2,400 years ago on the California coast. No longer exist. The only well-documented extinction that can be attributed to Native American hunting, although I think dogs and foxes may also have contributed to their disappearance on the islands and the mainlands. Not completely Native American hunting. The really interesting thing about this case is that humans overlapped with Chendites for at least 10,000 years. And yet it took 10,000 years, close to 10,000 years for them to go extinct. So it's a very long, protracted process. It's very different than flightless birds that you see in other island groups around the world, like New Zealand and Hawaii, or not Hawaii, but other Pacific islands, where human hunting tends to tip them over to extinction, sometimes within a few hundred years, 1,000 years at most. So this is a very different kind of extinction that takes a very long time. One other interesting pattern that we've looked at, we've just kind of gone by animal group to animal group. This is pinnipeds, seals and sea lions. There are 6 different species on the Northern Channel Islands, which is extraordinary worldwide. the highest number of species in any one area that I think are recorded anywhere in the world. And they go anywhere from the huge elephant seals to the relatively diminutive harbor seal. Archaeologically, we can trace patterns of pinniped hunting back 10,000 years. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of seal and sea lion bones in museums from the Channel Islands and up and down the Pacific coast. And the modern pattern on the islands is really dominated, even though there's 6 species present, it's dominated by northern elephant seals. There are thousands of them and they take up enormous amounts of space. But when you look at the archaeological data, there's almost never any hunting of elephant seals on the Channel Islands. And it's rare along the mainland coast as well. And that's really interesting because what is abundant archaeologically is the Guadalupe fur seal, which barely even exists on the Channel Islands today. They're called the Guadalupe fur seal because the only place they bred was Guadalupe Island off Mexico. And only in the last few years, when there are 150 or 160,000 seals and sea lions of the 5 other species, have Guadalupe fur seals been shown to arrive and pup on San Miguel Island. Only a handful of them have been documented. But archaeologically, they're by far the most abundant. So there's a disjunct here between the historic restoration situation and the ancient situation of the last 10,000 years. So a big picture overview, we can now put together 12,000 years of sort of generalized picture of economic change. Paleocoastal, mostly marine hunting, waterfowl and birds, some shellfish, some fishing, but it looks like there's a lot of hunting based on the technology. By the early Holocene, starting about 10,000 years ago to 8,000 or 7,500 years ago, the emphasis is really heavy on shellfish collecting. Most of the meat comes from shellfish, and it's supplemented by fish, marine mammals, and birds, and plant foods, importantly, but shellfish seem to dominate. In the Middle Holocene, there's this gradual intensification of fishing and pinniped hunting, and that really ramps up in the late Holocene, which is the last 3,500 years into the heyday of island Chumash occupation, 1,500 to 500 years ago, with really intensive fishing in kelp beds and near shore, but also expanding into the big pelagic fish like swordfish, pelagic sharks, big tunas, and this we think is a technologically facilitated expansion. It's partly new types of fish hooks. Circular shell fish hook here starts about 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. Fish bone is 10 times more abundant after that period. But these big fish out in the pelagic zone are probably being taken from tomals, the famous sewn plank redwood canoes of the Chumash. And they're so stable that they allowed people to go out and do really open water fishing and harpooning of these really big fish and then bring them back. So this is kind of as I said, a broad overview. So what we see there then is thousands of years really of sustainability and resilience. The same species, almost no extinction. Yes, there are size changes in shellfish. Yes, there are changes in the proportion of shellfish versus fish. But it's an incredible picture of 10 to 12,000 years of sustainable economy and more or less stable ecosystems and resilience of the ecosystems. And all of that comes to a crashing halt in AD 1769 when the Spaniards arrive on the California coast. And the missions are built one by one in Ventura and Santa Barbara and up and down the coast. This is often kind of a romanticized, the mission period, the mission fathers, the Spanish. We've got fiesta days in Santa Barbara, Spanish architecture everywhere. But it's worth remembering that this was a period of tremendous suffering and really terrible time for the Chumash. Old world diseases that they'd never had any experience with, had no resistance to, decimated them. Probably 90% of the population died within 50 years to 60, 70 years in the mission period from disease alone. And then everything else that colonialism brought in, and the ranching and the total conversion of globalized economies and trade and overhunting and overfishing and overgrazing that comes after that. And that's this globalization of world economies led to things like the Sea of Slaughter. There's a great book called Sea of Slaughter that talks about the 18th and 19th century whaling and sealing, mostly to produce oil that was burned in lamps in Europe and America, and only really stopped once petroleum production started. People figured out how to make fuels from petroleum. But worldwide decimation of marine populations. The fur trade, this is in Alaska, but the piles of furs here, fur seals, sea otters, and many other fur bearers were just hunted nearly to extinction or to extinction around the world. The ranching period is also romanticized here in California and on the islands, but the early ranching with heavy livestock levels, especially of sheep and pigs and cattle and horses, the introduction on Santa Rosa of deer and elk fundamentally altered the ecosystems of the Channel Islands. And it's only with their removal, relatively recently, that things are starting to restore and we're getting a better picture of what the real Channel Islands look like. At the same time, in that historical ranching era, there were a lot of new species, exotic species of plant, olives, grapevines, eucalyptus, fennel, for cooking. Italian cooks on the Channel Islands brought fennel out, and it spread like wildfire and changed fundamentally some of the plant communities out there. This is one of the next big challenges for the Park Service and the Nature Conservancy, is to figure out how to get rid of some of the invasive plants now that they've successfully removed the livestock and other exotic mammals. Yet, the devastation that was wreaked in this colonial era and continues worldwide in many ways on a planet that is so altered by humans that scientists are on the verge of recognizing a brand new geological epoch. There's the Pleistocene and then the Holocene, and I would guess within a year or two they are going to officially designate the Anthropocene as a new geological epoch, marked by human domination of global ecosystems and systems, period. Watersheds, water, fisheries, atmosphere, the presence of radioactive isotopes in ice in Greenland. It's an amazing story of the accumulation of human impact on Earth ecosystems through time. And I believe we will be living in I think we're living in the Anthropocene now. The big debate we're having is whether the Anthropocene starts in AD 1950, as it looks like it's going to, or whether it really should start 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, when agriculture was developed and other changes around the world started to accumulate. But in this geological epoch, the Anthropocene of human domination and alteration and intervention of natural ecosystems, one of the reasons I keep going back to the Channel Islands is that they, for me, and many others, are literally landscapes of hope and inspiration. They are what California used to look like. And every year, they're starting to look more and more like what California used to look like. And the Nature Conservancy and the National Park Service's removal of livestock and other exotic mammals is literally restoring the island's terrestrial ecology, changing our notion of biodiversity, the nature of edible plant foods on the islands, animal populations, and the very hydrology of the islands, the freshwater resources. When everything was mowed down by sheep, goats, cattle, the plants were so low to the ground that they didn't extract almost any water out of the fog. Now the plants are growing up again and they're literally combing water out of the fog, what they call fog drip. And it doubles, in many places, the annual precipitation on the islands. It's changing the very nature of watersheds out there and the availability of fresh water, which we used to think was really restricted. Now we better understand why there are huge Chumash villages out in the middle of a spot where there's no fresh water. It's because the freshwater resources have been so altered in the last 150, 200 years of ranching and erosion and plant change. This, I told you about bluedicks, the Dichelostemma. This is on Santa Cruz Island last year after 3 years of severe drought. And every one of those purple flowers is a bluedick with a bulb full of carbohydrates like a potato, about that big. And Christina, as I said, has been finding these in archaeological sites everywhere. This is an absolutely incredible resource, edible food resource that the Chumash had for 10,000 years that we literally didn't know they had until recently, or we didn't know how abundant it is. It's virtually inexhaustible, I think. And so archaeologists used to think the Chumash had to import most of their plant foods from the mainland. I don't think they had to import anything. If they brought anything in the way of plant foods from the mainland, it was like a spice or something different. You might get sick of bluedicks every day after 361 days of eating them, although they're pretty tasty. But it's a phenomenal resource, and it's also one of those success stories where we can now see that native plant communities are coming back from 150 years of devastation. There are other success stories just like it. The island fox is a great one. Park Service, and with the Nature Conservancy and other partners, has done a great job of managing and restoring and reviving a very threatened species of island fox. And I don't care whether the Chumash brought the fox there or not. It's been there for 7,000 years, and it's an important part of those island ecosystems today. When those foxes were put in cages for captive breeding, I got to tell you, doing archaeology on the northern Channel Islands got pretty rough. Seagulls were everywhere, and they harassed us relentlessly. It was just terrible. Anacapa Island and Santa Barbara Island are like that today. They're dominated by seabirds, and we want to keep them that way. But on the northern Channel Islands, when they let the foxes out of those cages, those birds are still there, but they're not as abundant, and it's a lot more pleasant working out there. Another great success story, I told you about that eagle nest that we dug. It was, I don't know, that's a pretty big bird, and that's a huge nest. It's built entirely out of lemonade berry roots. And all of those lemonade berries that used to live on western San Miguel Island, which is like a caliche eroded landscape now, it apparently was full of lemonade berries earlier in the historic period. The cattle and sheep ate them, they died, the roots became available, eroded on the surface, the eagles picked them up, made the nest. I can't tell you, as someone who's worked a lot in Alaska, seen a lot of eagles, how wonderful it is to go back to the Channel Islands and see eagles flying over the landscape naturally and nesting on the islands. Great success story. The pinniped rookery on San Miguel Island, this massive Point Bennett pinniped rookery with sea lions here, sea lions there, all over here, all over there, elephant seals, fur seals. You know, at any given day there might be 50 or 80,000 of these things barking 24 hours a day. It's an amazing place to camp and do work. There are archaeological sites on these points. I've had a pinniped biologist take me down there, shoo them away gently, briefly, and they're destroying those sites. And so we're doing everything we can to at least date them and sometimes take a small sample before the pinnipeds destroy them completely. But this too, in 30, 40 years, is a tremendous success story. The weird thing about it, as I said, is that this is a population of pinnipeds, 6 different species, that's reviving, restoring, coming back, but it's coming back in a structure that we don't recognize in historical or archaeological data. They're reassembling themselves in what might be natural conditions, but they might not be. And maybe they will eventually reach a natural condition that we can see in the archaeological record, but maybe we won't. I think what we need to celebrate for now is that there's 100,000 seals and sea lions at Point Bennett. There is, by the way, a house pit, a big Chumash house pit village down in this area in the middle of that rookery that was occupied 500 years ago. And I guarantee you, when those people lived there, there was no rookery or pinnipeds around that village. So that again suggests that it may be something of a historical anomaly, but something like it has existed for 10,000 years, probably just more likely that it was out on rocky islets offshore than on the mainland here. And so, in concluding part 2, archaeology and historical ecology tell us that the Channel Islands and the mainland, Ventura County, have changed dramatically over the last 15,000 years since humans have been here. The island Chumash actively shaped island ecosystems for millennia. They had measurable impacts to some resources that we can see. And they also, I think, actively managed the habitat and enhanced the habitat via things like periodic burning that kept grasslands larger and kept bluedick fields, corm, geophyte fields more extensive. The Chumash clearly thrived on the islands for many, many thousands of years, and they created an amazing, complex, sustainable cultural and economy. And it was devastated by European colonization. The island Chumash were removed. Many of them died to diseases. The traditional economy, the monetary economy, the trade networks all broke down. And over 200 years of overhunting, overfishing, overgrazing fundamentally changed the nature of Channel Island ecosystems. And actually to such an extent that at one point we thought they were relatively marginal habitat for humans. And now I believe they aren't. I think they were paradise for 12,000 years or more. And paleocoastal peoples went there immediately and stayed there forever because the resources were amazingly rich in ways that we can only now understand because the restoration of the islands is providing these lessons of hope, inspiration, resilience, as well as a new understanding of the original richness of these island ecosystems. I might have one more, a thank you. Along with thanking all of you, I want to point out that what I've talked about tonight is not just my research. This is 50 people or more working for 30 or more years, lots of students that aren't listed here. There are Chumash people and archaeologists and biologists and geologists, Park Service people, Nature Conservancy people listed here. I'm quite sure I forgot many that I should have put on here, but there's only limited space. It's also been funded by a wide array of different agencies and universities and institutions, museums, and supported in a major way by the National Park Service and now the Nature Conservancy. And I hope all of you will continue to support the Park Service, Channel Islands National Park, the Marine Sanctuary, the Nature Conservancy, and all these other good organizations and individuals that help us not just understand the past, but use it to more effectively create a sustainable and amazing ecosystem off our coast. I leave with that last frontier I mentioned before, and a picture of me in a submarine last fall. This is not what I normally do, but the Nature Conservancy got a submarine for 4 days. Somebody donated the use of the submarine, and they insisted that if they were going to pay a little bit of money for a support boat, that I had to be in the submarine. And it was to explore the sea bottom between Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz Islands, that area that I mentioned called Crescent Bay. It was, initially I wasn't going to do it, and then I thought, oh, when are you ever going to get a chance to do this? I had no idea that the submarine was only 4.5 feet long in the interior, and I'm 6 feet tall. So my face was literally, I was lying on my stomach like this with my face in a faceplate, my legs buckled up behind me for 2 hours of every dive. It was unbelievably uncomfortable. We filmed the sea bottom the entire time, and I've never done anything more exciting in my life. So anyway, that's all I have to say. There is a last frontier out there, these submerged landscapes. We've just started this 4-year project to try to map them and understand them and see if we can actually find evidence for human occupation off the current shore which will add another exciting chapter, I think. So stay tuned. You want to pass it around?
And if you would like to wait until I come to the microphone, I'd be happy to give it to you so everybody can hear the question you want to ask.
I'm really interested in the crescents and how they use the crescents. Did they have any kind of bows, or did they just throw them at the birds, or did they have to get close enough to hammer at them, or how did that work?
And I'm supposed to repeat the questions for the camera. And so the question was, you're very interested in the crescents and how were they used. And our best guess at this point is that they were tied to the end of darts that were then thrown with atlatls, the throwing stick. It's sort of like, leverages, it's like a tennis racket. It allows you to throw a dart a long ways. And so that's what we think they did. We don't think they had the bow and arrow this early, although in Japan, they think the bow and arrow did exist this early. So we're not absolutely sure, but most likely they were put on darts and then launched at either individual birds or birds in flight.
I have a question. In the expansion that happened, in 40 to 50,000 years ago throughout the Pacific, in your slide it showed them going back up in the north. No chance, like Thor Heyerdahl, of getting across to South America back then, or was?
Yeah, was there any chance that rather than come around the North Pacific Rim that they went across the Pacific 40 or 50,000 years ago?
Yeah.
It is not impossible, it is possible, and it will only take one significant discovery to show that it happened. All you have to do is find a 40,000-year-old site on Easter Island or somewhere.
Wouldn't that be underwater though, back at that time?
It would be, which is difficult, but there, the sites in Melanesia that I mentioned, there are places there where the shoreline is extremely steep. It basically drops straight into a deep oceanic trench. And there are cave sites there. They didn't think anyone was on those islands before 3,500 years ago. But those shorelines have basically not moved in 40,000 years. If they've moved a few hundred yards, which means that people in those caves were always close to the ocean because it drops straight into the sea. And they were surprised, these were Australian archaeologists that dig test pits in caves on those islands, expecting to find 3,500-year-old material, and they found 37,000-year-old material and 40,000-year-old material. And that only happened about 20 years ago. And additional sites like that are still being found almost every year. So it's not impossible that somewhere else out in the deep, remote Pacific, a discovery like that could be found. The genetic evidence is increasingly compelling, however, and the people who moved into New Guinea and Australia have distinctive mitochondrial haplogroup types, and those are not found in the New World. And so it seems unlikely, but even that genetic work is in its early stages. So I don't doubt we're going to learn a lot of things in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It'll upset some of what I've been saying today. I did an interview recently for a magazine article in which I said something like, everything I learned in graduate school was wrong. It's great. And it wasn't completely true, because I learned a lot of stuff in graduate school that was really helpful. But some of these basic theories have just gone down the tank and reversed 180 degrees. And as more and more evidence accumulates, I know some of these things will change. Yeah.
I have a question. Do you know much about I think a year ago, I heard about a 14,000-year-old skeleton found off the Yucatan. But I haven't heard anything about that lately. Am I remembering that correctly, or what do you know about that?
Yeah, the question is about an ancient skeleton found in a submerged cave off the Yucatan coast. And it's in a karst limestone landscape where there are these deep, where rivers have run underground basically and created long linear caverns. And there have been divers exploring those, and they found a skeleton roughly 8 or 10 years ago, I think, as I recall, and brought it up and carbon dated it. And because it was underwater for so long, and then also exposed to seawater as sea level rose over that cave, there's some question about the dating. A good friend of mine was involved in it. He's really good at radiocarbon dating. It was in National Geographic a few months ago. There was a cover story on the First Americans that talked about some of our work on the islands, but the cover and much of the discussion was about that woman skeleton from that cave. So if you could go back and look at that, or the National Geographic website, I think you'll find out more. My recollection is that they concluded it was between 12 and 13,000 years old, but they couldn't be more certain than that. And it's what the media usually does is take the oldest date that you hear, and then that just gets repeated over and over again. So it could be 13,000, but I don't think it's 14,000. But it's still really old and really well preserved. It's quite a find.
So my question is related to your marine ecology in reference to the resources of Chumash we're getting now. In terms of water temperature, we know now El Nino decimates the kelp forest ecology now. While in the past, in terms of the resources, is there a measure of the temperature, for example, that may have made these different resources available to the Chumash? For example, were the red abalone at different depths at different times and more accessible? Were the pelagic fish showing up later because water got warmer? Is that temperature involved there?
Yeah, that's a very good question about sea surface temperature changes and how they've changed through time and how those might have affected the availability of resources for the Chumash. And there are really good records of ancient sea surface temperatures. They come from the Santa Barbara Basin, cores drilled into the bottom of the Santa Barbara Basin, where there are what we call varved sediments. It basically layers that are one per year. They change color every year depending on the season. And because it's a basin that has no oxygen in the bottom of it, it has tremendous preservation. So they can bring those cores up and analyze oxygen isotopes and diatoms and radiolaria, these microorganisms that are found in each layer, and document the sea surface temperature and how it's changed through time. And they have shown pretty emphatically, pretty clearly, that there have been significant changes through time. Like the El Niños that we have now, there have been El Niño shifts in the past, but there have also been broader, like millennial scale, 1,000-year periods when sea surface temperatures were either warmer or sometimes colder. One of them was the Younger Dryas periods, it's called, and it started about 12,900 years ago to about 11,800 years ago. And some of those shell middens on San Miguel Island that are 12,000 years old come from that time period, and the shellfish in them are cold water fauna. It's red abalones, which are still there, but there are also some chitons and things that are really from the north. And then there are other periods, 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, when it appears sea surface temperatures were a little warmer, when the red abalones basically disappear along with those other cold water faunas. So there definitely are changes through time. They may potentially affect the distribution of kelp, but we don't think so. We've modeled the extent of kelp forests through time around the islands, and we think they were actually much more abundant 14,000 to 10,000 years ago, and then they've shrunk through time. But it's a very good question. There are changes. The plot that I showed of red abalones shrinking through time At the very bottom of that, if I was to bring it back up, you would have seen these bars. It said W, C, and neutral. And those are cold water periods, warm water periods, and neutral periods. And when we look at changes in shellfish size through time, one of the first things we look at is what was the water temperature? And could that explain the change in size rather than human predation? So far, that doesn't, it appears to be human predation that is the main predictor. The other thing that we can do is we can take a mussel shell or an abalone shell that's 8,000 years old or 1,000 years old, and we can analyze, we take little drilled samples, and you can analyze the oxygen-18 isotope ratios. It's oxygen-18 to oxygen-16, and that tells you what the water temperature was, to within half a degree plus or minus. And you can actually see the change through the year, and we can determine what part of the year the shellfish were collected based on water temperature changes. But it also shows you much broader changes across the archipelago at the same time. Cold water on San Miguel, warmer water on Santa Cruz, and then changes through time. So the technologies that archaeologists can harness now are just phenomenal. The ancient DNA, the oxygen isotope, the carbon dating and other dating methods. And we can ask questions now that archaeologists wouldn't even have dreamed of 50 years ago, and certainly couldn't have answered, because the science is always changing. That's one of the reasons museums like this and my museum at the University of Oregon are so important. We archive those samples basically forever. And as new scientific techniques are developed, you can start to do analyses that you never even could have dreamed of before. So we're constantly going back to old museum samples and reanalyzing them to get more and newer information out of them. Great question.
I had a question about Beringa. Is that how you pronounce it? Beringia?
Beringia?
Beringia. It covers a wider swath than I was aware of for a long time. It seems like it's around the Aleutians and also north of the Aleutians in like central Alaska going over to Siberia. And I was looking at your charts of sea level depth, and were there not like 8 or 10 waves of people that came across with great deals of time between them? So there could have been waves coming down to the central United States and along the west coast where there were gaps of thousands of years when nobody came down at all, or nobody could get across on a land bridge.
Yeah, so the question is about Beringia and its extent, and also is it possible that there was more than one wave of human migration into the Americas from Northeast Asia? And Beringia, as it's been reconstructed from sea level changes, was as much as 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers wide at its maximum. And then it shrunk over a period of about 10 to 12,000 years ago and then was fully submerged. But even today, in the middle of winter, Inupiat people can walk from Asia to Alaska, or dog sled, or take a power sled at this point, because it freezes over. And so even after sea level rise submerged the central part of Beringia, it was still possible to go back and forth without a boat in the winter. The archaeological and other evidence has long suggested that there were at least 3 migrations. One was this maybe initial coastal migration, or maybe it was walking across Beringia, but it was early, 14, 15,000 years ago. There was probably another one, they call it the Na-Dene people, Athabascan-speaking peoples, who most people think came maybe 9,000 years ago. And then there was another one 3,500 years ago when the ancestors of Eskimo people, Inuit, Inupiat peoples, clearly came out of Northeast Asia and kind of swept across the Arctic. And it's quite possible that there was interchange back and forth, and there may actually have been more waves than those 3. We just don't know for sure. The genetic data are providing a whole new way of analyzing these questions. And unfortunately, you'll get these studies that are published where somebody emphatically says there was only one wave. And then somebody else will come along 6 months later and say emphatically, there were at least 5 waves. And I just don't think we have enough data yet to really say emphatically anything of that kind. We need more information. But it clearly was a route that people have gone back and forth, I think, for many thousands of years.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions tonight. I would like to just give another thank you to our speaker tonight, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you.